And we're rolling. All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. Hope you all had a good Thanksgiving. Let me adjust that. And the now it's time for to crunch and get towards finals. Um, we have a little bit of the Civil War lecture left, and also Reconstruction after that. But then we'll be done. And so hopefully if we can get through all of that, we're going to be doing a study session on Thursday so that you guys um, can be better prepared for the final. The final will be essentially what the midterm was, just with terms from the second half of this course, and will be worth the same. And that will be available on Friday and will continue to be available all the way until the following Friday. So you have an entire week to take it. Oh, by the way, there's going to be twice as many terms as last time. So each term will be worth 10 points. And the final time that you can take the final is all the way until Friday at 11:59 p.m. Now for the reading journal, which this time will have an actual like turn-in thing on Learn. That will be up hopefully soon right after this, and will be available all the way until Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. So it will be available from whenever I figure out how to do it on Learn today, all the way until 11:59 p.m. next Wednesday. Not this Wednesday, next. So you have a large swath of time to do both of these things. Hopefully you've been reading alongside, because those are weekly readings. You're supposed to be reading each one each week and taking your thoughts down in a journal. But you have all the way until Wednesday of next week to finish that, and then of course the final Friday 11:59 p.m. next week. Okay, so let's just move right on to the leftover bit of lecture from the Civil War. And word of warning: this gets dark because it's the Civil War. So here we go. This one, thank you. Oop, that's the one. Hold on. I think I am sharing the wrong screen. And it is not allowing me to change the meeting controls. What the heck? Ah, that's why. Oh, you guys get to see my notes. That's why it wasn't going to the right one. Sorry about that. Hold on. What the heck? There we go. Don't know why that wasn't working. All right, so we left off talking about the end of the Civil War. This wait, can somebody type in the chat? Is it actually showing the slide?
No, your
Again?
slide is a lot smaller.
It's
Yeah.
showing the notes. Come on.
And then in the background, there's like a smiley face.
Yeah. Hold on. That's just my background. Why is it doing that? There we go. Now it should be working. Right?
Yeah, you're good.
Cool. Thank you. Don't know why Zoom was being weird. It was confusing my different screens and kept on trying to go to the wrong screen. Anyways, so the Civil War was by far the worst war the United States has ever engaged in. Essentially, it was the U.S. beating up itself, right? Um, and the casualties number up to 2 million. Um, so casualties, remember, include wounded and missing. Um, so normally abbreviated as WIA or MIA. Um, and remember that that huge amount of prisoners that were also taken on both sides, numbering up to 400,000. So about 3 million people served throughout the course of the war, but um, only about 1 million of them came out unscathed. That's a pretty stark contrast to any war that we've ever fought since then. And even before that, well, except for the Revolutionary War and some Indian wars where those casualty numbers start to have the same kind of ratio. Um, but that also was 2 million people sounds like a lot, but you also have to keep in mind the US's population was much smaller than it is today. This amounted to about 10% of all Americans were casualties in this war. 10%. That's true decimation. Though, that isn't the number of dead. The total number of dead is arguable and can vary as much as 100,000, depending on how you count it, and also whether or not the people who went missing are counted as fatalities. So that number goes between 620,000 and 750,000 dead, which comes out to about 3% of the US population. That's just unimaginable amount of people dead. Imagine if 2% of the population today was killed off. That would come out to around what would that come out to? 9 million. That would come out to 9 million people dead today. So think about how nasty this war was. But it was also fought. It was fought in the North as seen as kind of a righteous cause, and in the South, they saw righteousness in their own cause as well. Everyone always does. And so the antipathy did not end with the Civil War. In fact, only 2 weeks after Lee surrendered, Lincoln was assassinated in a theater by John Wilkes Booth. Now, Booth had actually conspired with a number of other conspirators to try to assassinate the entire upper echelon of government, killing the vice president, the secretary of state, secretary of treasury, the attorney general. All of them were supposed to be assassinated in one night. Only the only other one to near assassination was Secretary of State, who um, got a knife in him, but was not killed by that knifing. Um, and so the four other conspirators were hanged. But to really show the antipathy that was left over from the Civil War, when Booth killed Lincoln by shooting him in the back of the head, he leaped from the balcony of a theater that Lincoln was in down onto the ground, broke his leg in the process, and yelled out "Sic semper tyrannis," or thus is what tyrants get. Um, so not a good way to start the end of to start reconstructing a broken nation. Um, in Throughout the 1850s, there had been this rise of um, remember we had talked about the Great Awakening and all that there'd been a lot of people who had turned towards spiritualism and that, and so they started holding seances in the 1850s. But after the war, suddenly there were a lot of people who wanted to commune with the dead because, well, there were so many dead, roughly 3% of the country. um, and so from the 1860s to 70s, you saw this huge uptick in spiritualism, specifically in trying to deal with the massive loss of that, and that would end up morphing into what is known as the social gospel and turn um, religion into progressivism in the early 20th century. So a lot of what is to come was built by the Civil War. Um, and of course, the people who had survived had to deal with the aftermath as well. Lincoln, in his second inaugural address, had specifically stated that we needed to keep, he had said that we had to rebuild the country and, you know, take care of all those veterans. Remember how often veterans who weren't taken care of took matters into their own hands back during the early republic. So this is not just a nice thing to do. It's a dire consequence of having this many veterans. And so um, in his 1865 inaugural address, Lincoln said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." So, you know, this Lincoln was trying to set a tone here, despite all the antipathy that would end up taking his life only a few months later. Um, and uh, this is kind of what the idea of Reconstruction is. It's to it's to deal with the aftermath and reconstruct a fractured nation. Um, and we'll be getting to that in the Reconstruction lecture, like all the different meanings of that. But the veterans ended up forming their own veterans groups. For instance, the Grand Army of the Republic was formed in only a year after the war, um, which was kind of the first major veterans organization. There had been other ones like the Society of the Cincinnati, but this is basically the predecessor to today's American Legion and Veterans of Foreign Wars. Um, but the this was only for Union troops, so there was still a huge divide, and eventually Confederate veterans formed their own groups that would lead towards what is called the Lost Cause. Um, and we'll talk a lot about that in the Reconstruction letter as well. lecture, not letter. So um, since we're going to be talking about Reconstruction anyways today, I'm not going to go over all of it in this particular slide, but the main idea was how to bring back the South into the Union and what needed to happen for the Union. So you had Sherman's promise of 40 acres and a mule to Black people in the South during his march through Georgia. Um, then there was the passage of the 13th Amendment, which was not ratified until December 6th, 1865, which is actually after the Civil War, um, which officially ended slavery throughout the entire U.S., including the border states, even though it had been ended by the Civil War in all of the secessionist states. And the war ultimately determined that the term "a more perfect union" written in the Constitution very clearly stated that the union shall not be broken; it is permanent, as had been said in the Articles of Confederation, um, as well as in the Northwest Ordinance. A number of things prior to this had basically said that secession was illegal and unconstitutional. This determined that. So the only real way to win independence, if you so declare it, is to win the war. And that was not what the South did. It also meant that people could no longer threaten to secede over petty issues just because politics did not go their way. Um, so the whole "take your toys home" um, attitude was officially taken away from the South, no longer considered legal or constitutional. And so the ultimate conclusion of the Civil War was that a actual nation was formed. No longer could people threaten to leave over petty issues. The issue of slavery had been kind of solved. We'll see that that's not exactly the case, but the the foundational doctrine of self-determination in that was now rooted in people rather than states, and that these people were, as in citizens, especially male citizens. We won't be getting towards towards female suffrage until um, next semester if you're taking that class with me. But the for male citizens were now seen not just as citizens of their states, but citizens of an American nation. This created America as a nation. So let's move on to get out of the way. Thank you. Um, Towards the final lecture on Reconstruction, basically trying to determine what the heck to do about all of all that's left. Hold on. So Reconstruction is generally seen as going between 1863 and 1877. So it technically started during the war. It was it was already being implemented in places like Tennessee by the time General Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Um, Now, there is this idea of a greater Reconstruction, as postulated by historian Elliot West, which is basically that the entire country was trying to deal with how to reconstruct race, not just the South. And we'll touch a little bit on that, but for the most part, when we're talking about Reconstruction here, we are only talking about the South. But even that has a contested meaning. Um, Lincoln clearly wanted it to be basically post-war rehabilitation, but his ability to control that was taken out of his hands by John Wilkes Booth. Um, so there was this question of how to deal with Reconstruction. Is it supposed to be punishment? Is it supposed to be recovery? These dueling ideas played a key role in how the U.S. arbitrated the next decade of trying to figure out what to do with the South. Um, the South obviously wanted it to be just purely recovery, and just to go back to their antebellum ways, including trying to find conniving ways to reinstitute slavery, um, but eventually resorted to just disenfranchising Black people while still letting them not be slaves. Um, Woohoo! The uh, the um, the North wanted less of a reconciliatory attitude. They want a lot of people in the North wanted to basically turn all the South into territories like the West was, and force them to go through the same process of being admitted back into the Union. Um, this, and they wanted all the traitors hung, hanged. The word is hanged when you're talking about people. It wanted mass incarceration and all these kinds of things. People were angry, and the antipathy was very real. But Congress and the president who followed Lincoln were not so keen on that kind of attitude. In fact, it would be a gross inaccuracy to call Reconstruction punishment. But you will hear people trying to say that. They are wrong. And they have no conception of what Reconstruction really is. So there's also this question of which states were being reconstructed. We talked a little bit about Greater Reconstruction. Um, and then there's also this question of whether or not Reconstruction was about civil or states' rights. Remember, by the end of the Civil War, we had determined that Americans were Americans first, citizens to their states second. That the creation of the Union created Americans, but ultimately it was the Civil War that did that. And so the question was, is it a state's right to come back into the Union, or can civil rights be held over these states until they abide by them? Until they abide by them, to admit them back into the Union. And this would be the enduring question for which the South remained under Reconstruction. There's also this idea that remember we had talked about free soilers earlier in the class, and that idea that the West was for free soil, as in free labor, people who could labor under their own terms, and therefore slavery was not abided by. Now that slavery was eliminated, the question of how free labor actually was became a prominent question. Throughout this period, for instance, we will see the rise of the Knights of Labor, a trade or a labor union that was perhaps the biggest union in American history, um, though it would fall in 1876. Um, and so, what historian Eric Foner calls all of this is the unfinished revolution. That there's this kind of these open questions were never solved. Civil rights would be put in the Constitution, but by the end of it, we'll see that they weren't abided by. Um, and so, um, remember, I had talked a little bit about, was Reconstruction punishment in that? You'll get a lot of people who say, that, and they're what's called lost causers. Now, lost causers believe in four central myths. They think that the Civil War wasn't, that slavery was good for the slaves. Civil War was not about slavery. That it was a war of northern aggression, and that Reconstruction was um, was arbitrary punishment. Every single one of those is wrong, but it would come to define Southern ideology almost into the present. We still see fighting over the lost cause myth even today. That's what all this stuff about statues and Confederate flags and all that kind of stuff boils down to, this lost cause myth. So it's a very hateful ideology, but this time it was kind of about trying to redeem themselves, and we will run into what are called Redeemer Democrats. And Redeemer Democrats are nothing like Democrats today. The parties have switched substantially from what they were in the 1860s. Um, you know, the Democrats at this point are very much a Southern party, um, and the South will form what's called the Solid South throughout this period, which also means that Republicans, because of the Civil War and the Democrats' association with secession, um, would remain the party in power for half a century. They would maintain power all the way until the 1930s. Um, 1933 to be exact. Um, so while there would be two Democratic presidents in between them, those two were rather different from the Democrats we think of today. So keep in mind when we're talking about Democrats and Republicans that the parties have basically switched on a lot of these issues, though not exactly on, neither party wants segregation or anything along those lines today. But in terms of their sectional interests, they remain, the Republican Party has very much become the party of the South, whereas the Democrat Party has become the party of the North, which is exactly the opposite of what it was in 1865. So the first attempt at Reconstruction was under Lincoln, and Lincoln had probably the easiest policy of Reconstruction. We had talked a little bit about his kind of reconciliatory attitude, and him wanting to, and I believe in the for this week's reading, or maybe last week's reading, it was Lincoln's second inaugural address. Read it. He continuously talks about the need to reinstate the South. Um, and so his first policy in 1862 was to start um, placing military governors of um, areas retaken by the Union Army. Um, in fact, his vice president that he was reelected with was a Democrat named Andrew Johnson, who he had appointed to be Tennessee's governor in 1864. So during the campaign, he was actually a military governor, um, though not in the military himself. Um, the and that attempt in 1864 during the election was another um, way of showing, like, hey, I'm trying to be conciliatory. I've got a Democrat on my ticket. See, um, problem is that Democrat became president as soon as John Wilkes Booth eliminated Lincoln. But before that, Lincoln, of course, passed basically used the Confiscation Acts um, to proclaim emancipation in the South, which officially went into effect in January 1st, 1863. And while it was only for enemy territory, which, by definition, he did not have control of, um, throughout the war, Lincoln would gain control of it and free slaves as the Union went. So the Union Army was essentially enacting the 13th Amendment long before it was passed. And the 13th Amendment um, was passed passed Congress in January of 1865, though it wouldn't be ratified until December. So Lincoln had all of these people that he had to deal with, all of these Southerners who had been fighting against him and everything. And so he created what he called not what he called, what was called throughout the South the Ironclad Oath, which was essentially Lincoln's 10% plan. And so this 10% plan was that 10% of Southern males had to, of each Southern state, had to take an oath before being brought back into the Union. 10% of the population had to take this ironclad oath, which read, I do solemnly swear or affirm that I have never voluntarily borne arms against the United States since I have been a citizen thereof, that I have voluntarily given no aid, countenance, counsel, or encouragement to persons engaged in armed hostility to thereto. And it goes on for a little bit, but you get the idea. This was essentially a loyalty oath that people had to denounce the Confederate cause, and Lincoln only wanted 10% of that, but that was amended that was going to be amended, I should say, in 1864, but Lincoln kept that conciliatory attitude and vetoed the bill. So that 10% plan remained. And one of his last major acts of conciliation was the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, it's actually kind of arguable whether or not Lincoln supported this, but Congress was ran by a lot of radical Republicans. Lincoln was more of a moderate, but he did not veto it. And it created, in the 3rd of March, 1865, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands was created. And this essentially made a, a federal administration, or bureau, to help resituate ex-slaves. Um, they would be given a stipend, education, and land. Um, in fact, later on, there would be the creation of a Southern Homestead Act to try to push this even further, um, where it allowed the U.S. government to distribute lands according to the Western Homestead Act, um, to freemen, basically to resettle the South for all these former slaves. Um, and you know, this was the direction the U.S. was going when Lincoln got assassinated. Um, and so Johnson was his Democrat running partner, um, was actually a lot harsher. So he was a Northern Democrat, and Northern Democrats were very much opposed to secession, and so he very much um, you know wanted to use the Reconstruction process to guarantee Southern loyalty. That it was about um, the states rather than the people themselves, and that's why it was still just a 10% oath. Um, so Lincoln was perfectly fine with pardoning Confederates in that. Johnson uh, was not so likely to do that. Um, he also simplified the ironclad oath, um, so that it denounced leaders rather, and made it very much about the leadership rather than the entirety of the South. You can see he's a Northern Democrat. To really um, he wanted to really make this about the Southern Democrats, um, rather than the entirety of the South, who was definitely complicit. Um, the Southern states also were forced to in terms of trying to get readmission, um, was and remember, being admitted means that you can vote for president, and that, for instance, even today we still have territories that cannot vote for president. Guam and Puerto Rico come to mind. um, they don't they don't have representation in Congress, um, and technically Congress can overrule any local laws and send and the president can actually appoint governors, even though we don't actually do that anymore. We let the local populace of Guam and Puerto Rico choose their own leaders, but technically the president still has that power. Um, and so that's kind of the situation that the South was in, even though they were not officially territories. They're in this weird limbo of Reconstruction. Um, so the South was forced to pledge that they would um, give Black people political rights, but that didn't have any means of enforcement. It was purely a pledge, and turns out Johnson didn't really care about Black people's political rights. Um, he was still a Southerner himself. He just was a Northern Democrat. Um, and so he still had a lot of that white supremacist background. He had been appointed governor of his home state, Tennessee. Um, he was um, more about the look of it, as politicians are apt to do. though as part of um, rejoining the Union, the Southern states were also required to ratify the 13th Amendment, thereby reaffirming that that slavery was abolished. Um, so the uh, the final thing of his uh, harsher reinstatement was um, that all debts for the Confederacy had to be renounced, and even the idea of secession had to be renounced by the state legislatures. Um, this seems like it's not that much, but remember, bloodiest war in American history. These people had fought and died, and the Confederacy had experienced a lot more death percentage wise. Um, Even though the Union had definitely had more casualties. After all, 2 million people served in the Union Army, whereas only 1 million people served in the Southern Army. So more casualties was almost inevitable, especially when fighting a defending force. And so but the South was was reticent to even abide by these terms. The, these terms don't seem like much, but remember, we're talking about people who are very much about honor. Um, Honor culture remained a prevalent thing in the South, and the South would remain a very violent place for the next decade. Um, and we'll talk a lot about that for the rest of the lecture. Um, but the South responded in kind by passing what are called the Black Codes, starting with Mississippi in 1866. And these Black Codes were essentially the same as the slave codes before them, except, not having to do with slavery. So it penalized Black people for even loitering or anything along those lines, and could um, send these vagrants, as they were called, to jail to work off a sentence, often very harsh sentence for vagrancy. And so a lot of people saw this as basically reinstituting slavery. Um, though you weren't actually a slave, you were doing the work of a slave and being penalized simply for being Black. Um, so these oh, and by the way, that the working at in jail is called convict leasing. It's actually still done today, but under very different circumstances. Um, the Confederate states also sent ex-Confederate leaders to Congress. Now, Congress actually has the ability to deny people seats. They can vote to censure people, and so they voted um, on the 5th of December 1865 to bar all ex-Confederates from all ex-Confederate leaders from being seated in Congress. So while it didn't actually affect Congress's ability to vote, it's a really bad look, and it very much violates Johnson's entire Reconstruction plan, kind of showing its weakness because, it's all about oaths rather than, any kind of enforcement. And then the final blow to Johnson's form of Reconstruction was a couple of riots that happened in in uh, Memphis, Tennessee, and New Orleans. These are called race riots, but are more akin to race massacres. In New Orleans, people trying to create a new state constitution were fired upon by ex-Confederates, killing 48 of them, 46. That's yeah, killing 48 of them, 44 of them, 44 of which were black. And the Memphis riot was started by police shooting at a batch of black veterans who were returning from the war and everything. It's unclear who shot first and all that kind of stuff, but it's very clear who took the most casualties. For 46 black people were killed in the riot, where only 2 of the police were killed. So these race riots were seen as kind of the final blow against Johnson's plan, even though these kinds of things would continue all the way into the 1920s, that there were these kinds of major race riots almost every other year for in the South, and even many in the North, all the way until the 1920s. And we're talking massive amounts of casualties. For instance, one in 1921 took around 100 black people's lives. So we're talking triple digits in some of these. But Johnson's plan was clearly not enough. So Republicans in Congress started trying to force Johnson to move, and so they wanted to make Reconstruction more radical. So they passed a extension of the Freedmen's Bureau first, and Johnson immediately vetoed it. This would become the dynamic for an entire year and a half, where Congress would make a move and Johnson would try to fight it. And so the Freedmen's Bureau wasn't extended, although it would still continue to function all the way until 1872. But they wanted to extend it all the way until 1880. So this was a big move on their part, and it failed. They didn't bother to override the veto. But then they passed the Civil Rights Act in 1866. And this was essentially what would become the 14th Amendment, but as legislation. It's kind of a big question of whether or not Congress could even do that without the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment is essentially civil rights. It's the thing that gives civil rights, even today. Well, also the 15th. And we'll get to that. But the 15th Amendment is voting rights. The 14th Amendment is civil rights. The 13th Amendment is abolition. Keep those in mind. Those are all called Reconstruction Amendments. But the predecessor to the 14th Amendment was passed in 1866, and of course, Johnson vetoed it. Just to illustrate how much of a party switch happened, there would be a later President Johnson who is famous for signing a Civil Rights Act in 1964. And he was also a Democrat. So very, very different parties. And this time, Congress overrode his veto. But that wasn't strong enough, because now you have to get Johnson to actually administer civil rights. Plus, there's that whole constitutionality question. But even before that, the people who ran the various departments under Johnson were actually following through with what Congress wanted. But Johnson didn't want that. And so he started making moves to fire the people within his cabinet. Remember, these are all leftovers from the Lincoln cabinet, to basically put in his own allies who were more anti-civil rights. Um, and in something that was definitely unconstitutional, but still, um, something that wasn't argued in Supreme Court for decades. Um, Congress passed in February of 1867 the Tenure of Office Act, which basically said that um, Johnson had to seek congressional approval to fire um, people, and he was actually trying to fire people, and he would continue to do so, acting as if the law hadn't happened. He vetoed the Tenure of Office Act, but of course, you know, Congress overrode it on the 2nd of March, 1867, thereby making it a law anyways. And in June of 1866, Congress passed the 14th Amendment, making, though it wouldn't be ratified until 1868, this was clearly saying that that they wanted to override all the constitutionality problems of the Civil Rights Act and make it a constitutional amendment. And even though it wouldn't be ratified until 1868, this was a clear move by Congress to go around Johnson and all his veto power. And so the this 14th Amendment also says that how to deal with the oaths and all that kind of stuff. So it basically proposed how Reconstruction would be done for the rest of the time. This was a complete change in how Reconstruction would be administered. And so Johnson didn't like that. So Johnson reacted in 1866 by taking a speaking tour throughout the North, known as the Swing Around the Circle. But instead of gaining the public's sympathy in that, he kind of made a fool of himself, especially when somebody yelled "Hang Jeff Davis," the Confederate president. He tried to talk that person down, and that was seen as kind of a national embarrassment. And then also in Cleveland, Johnson angrily replied to one of these hecklers by saying, "Why don't you hang Thad Stevens and Wendell Phillips, the two kind of leaders of the radical Republicans in Congress?" Him publicly calling for the hanging of congressmen is not a good look. So he kind of came back from this whole thing in disgrace, and clearly making Congress turn further and further against him. And then he started trying to fire the Secretary of War. Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, actually wanted to use the U.S. Army to enforce the Civil Rights Act and later 14th Amendment, but obviously Johnson didn't want that. So he fired Stanton during a congressional recess, citing that fact that since Congress was in recess, he couldn't get their permission anyways, and started trying to find a replacement. One of those replacements was, in fact, Ulysses S. Grant. But Congress refused, and Congress officially reinstated Stanton on the 13th of January, 1868. Um, and just a month later, Johnson once again fired him officially, this time also not seeking permission from Congress. Um, and actually and Stanton ended up having to barricade his office to stay there. Um, he was literally spent 3 days in office barricaded while the Senate had to vote on whether or not the firing would go through. And instead of voting on whether or not the firing would go through, the House voted to impeach Johnson. Um, on the 24th of February, 1868, um, the articles of impeachment passed, being the first time in the history of the United States that passed on a sitting president. Um, um, but the articles of impeachment are weird because it's not just a vote of no confidence or anything. You actually have to make specific allegations, and then the Senate decides on whether or not to convict on those allegations. And it's a real question about like what happens after that conviction. No president has been convicted um, thus far. We saw in impeachment hearings earlier this year, if you guys remember that. And remember, Trump was not convicted. Same thing happened here, though obviously for much, much greater problems. Refusing to enforce civil rights, during Reconstruction, that's whoa. Um, and but they made it more about the whole Tenure of Office Act and the fact that he had tried to remove Stanton so much. Um, and in fact, this might have been kind of a legal strategy that they were trying to make it about some specifically provable thing rather than like a refusal to enforce civil rights. Um, but that also means that Congress requires the Senate requires a 2/3 vote for conviction, and Johnson came within a hair's breadth of that. Um, so the so a radical Republican flips sides on it for the sake of the nation. The idea of removing a president during Reconstruction um, was kind of seen as something that would basically cause the Civil War to reignite, right? Um, so this was more less about trying to convict the president on very clearly violating the law, and more um, trying to keep the country together. Um, you can argue on whether or not that was a good thing, but because of this impeachment and because of the acrimony behind all the um, procedures and all that, Johnson was basically relegated to not participating in Reconstruction any further. And so this is a change to what we could call congressional Reconstruction. Um, or a lot of people like to call it radical Reconstruction, but in fact, there were more moderates in Congress than radicals. Um, but that's older terminology and plays a lot into that whole lost cause myth that we talked about earlier. But the Republicans first passed the Military Reconstruction Acts on the 2nd of March, 1867. So they're moving quick, right? This is just a few days after the impeachment hearings. And this is essentially said that the military could enforce civil rights, that the military could intervene in any kind of civil matter, and created military districts out of all of the South. fact, I think the next one, yeah. So you can see here, these are the military districts. You have, um, you can see each one is actually more than one state. Tennessee was admitted back in the Union during Johnson's Reconstruction, so they weren't actually included in these military districts. Um, though Virginia is kind of special because she's kind of seen as the leader of the South, and so that's why Virginia is the only one to get their own military district. Otherwise, each district would have a main commander, and the military governors of each state, um, were subordinate to him. Um, in response to this, a fraternal organization that was actually a theater club to begin with, believe it or not, arose in the South, called the Ku Klux Klan. Um, it was originally just a theater troupe, but they increasingly used their um, costumes and whatnot, including some folks who dressed up in white pointy robes. But there were a variety of Ku Klux costumes at this point, and started using those costumes to gallivant around on horseback and scare black voters. It was very much about intimidation, and because of the Ku Klux having that whole theater behind it, they became kind of the big organization that all these intimidation tactics would come under. Um, and so from 1867 all the way into the 1870s, they tried to intimidate voters. Now, if we go to this map, you can see there's also another date under each of these that says, 1874, 1871. So the black date is referring to when it was admitted into the Union. The purple date is referring to when it became a Democrat stronghold again. Because remember, black people are voting and they're not likely to vote for Democrats at this point. So they're voting Republican because Republicans had just freed them from slavery. And were fighting to maintain their civil rights. But the KKK was very much trying to eliminate that by voter suppression and intimidation. Black people were too poor at this point. Remember, they had just been freed to have horses or anything along those lines. So instead, the KKK managed to actually managed to basically become a paramilitary organization for the Democrats. Problem is, this didn't work out for them, and in 1870, on the 31st of May, 1870, the Congress actually passed the what's known as the Ku Klux Act, or the Enforcement Act, which allowed the U.S. Army to be used to try to fight and arrest any known KKK members. And in 1871, their official leader at this point, named Nathan Bedford Forrest, known as the Grand Wizard, actually claimed that around 500,000 members of the Klan, and that he could send an army of 40,000 of them to march on Washington. But this never materialized, and he officially rescinded his leadership and the KKK in 1872. And many people were arrested, but hardly anybody got convicted under the Enforcement Act. And so this ensured Republican dominance on the national level, but it was a fight in the South to maintain that Republican dominance. It was basically purely on black voters to do that. And the only way you can keep black voters is to keep them from being intimidated away from the polls. And so on the 26th of February, 1869, as part of all of this reconstruction, the 15th Amendment was passed. And this is essentially the guarantee of voting rights for all men. It says the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So this is how congressional Reconstruction was moving along, but it kind of floundered. Now, the next president, who was elected in 1868 and took the presidency in 1869, was Ulysses S. Grant himself. There was no way Johnson was getting reelected, especially when he tried to create a coalition party of basically the weakest Republicans, and completely failed to even get the Republican nomination. So the Grant administration was mired in controversy constantly, all kinds of scandals constantly. He also tried to make Reconstruction a lot about the West. Remember, the Civil War had basically been fought over what to do with the West in terms of slavery. And now he wanted to deal with all of the Indians in the West by creating what he called a peace policy. And that failed spectacularly in 1876 when General Custer was killed on the nation's centennial birthday. And so clearly that peace policy had failed miserably. And it was kind of a distraction from what was happening in the South. So Congress repeatedly floundered on these things. They kept on using what was called the bloody shirt. And essentially the idea of the bloody shirt is that radical Republicans would say, we fought this war to do X, Y, and Z, and look at all our dead. They would keep on flying that bloody shirt, and people were getting tired of the rhetoric. In fact, in 1872, because Grant was considered a radical for some reason, a faction of the Republicans, the more moderate ones, broke off to create the liberal Republicans. Yeah, the 1872 liberal Republicans were considered to be less radical than Republicans. Trying to wrap your mind around that, considering current events. And the Republican who was leading this charge was a guy named Horace Greeley, and we've talked about him before, who had turned more and more moderate throughout Reconstruction. This guy had been such a radical before that he had literally employed Karl Marx for a decade. Karl Marx survived off of Horace Greeley. Was also pen pals with Lincoln, though. But neither Lincoln nor Greeley were particularly radical. And so Greeley was trying to use Lincoln's legacy to gain election, but it was a farce. There was no way they were going to win. And so Grant was reelected in 1872. But throughout this period, we saw a rise in white supremacist violence. Even though the KKK had been eliminated by the Enforcement Act, a series of other groups came about, like the White League, as pictured here. A lot of Americans consider the White League no better than the KKK, but the KKK would, use costumes to hide themselves. The White League was just out in the open. They weren't hiding. And, you can intimidate people at the polls all you want, as long as you're not actually killing them. And there were also the red shirts and the what were known as the um, because remember, black people didn't have horses, and that, and a good way of intimidating voters is by riding around with weaponry on horseback. There were a series of baseball clubs known as saber and horse baseball clubs. I don't know how you play baseball with a saber and a horse. Um, so, these were pretty obvious, just trying to recreate the KKK. Um, and they were they were extremely successful in the 1870s, and at suppressing the vote. At the same time, a batch of Democrats came about called Redeemers, who were trying to redeem the South for white men. These Redeemer Democrats were basically trying to restore antebellum greatness. But they wouldn't actually succeed until the 1880s. And once again, we've talked about the lost cause, but this is where the lost cause starts being a potent political force. It's the thing fueling the suppression of black votes in that. And can we get through this in 3 minutes? I don't know. I don't think we can get through this in 3 minutes. So we'll leave the rest of that for Thursday. We'll talk about the end of Reconstruction and how it came to end, because it's weird. You have a depression, an economic depression, then further stuff with Grant, and finally what's often called the corrupt bargain. Jim Crow would not come about until the late 1880s. So there's a few decades in there in which the South is not under segregation. But we'll see how that comes about on Thursday. Any questions before we leave? Anyone? Let's stop the screen share. No further questions? Okay, well, I'm going to stop the record here.